Ava Monroe thought she had finally found forever when she married Daniel Price, the man who promised her unconditional love. But on their dream honeymoon in the Maldives, that promise turned into a nightmare. Beneath the bright sun and turquoise waters, paradise hid a deadly secret. Within days, Ava, a woman who had fought her whole life to live authentically, would be gone, and Daniel would be the only one left to tell the story. What began as a love story ended as one of the most shocking honeymoon murders the world had ever seen. Ava Monroe had waited her whole life for a love that saw her for who she truly was. Growing up in a small town outside Chicago, she had spent years hiding pieces of herself, learning which truths to keep silent and which smiles to wear in front of others. By the time she transitioned in her late 20s, she had already lost friends and even her family's support. But through all of it, she held on to one belief: that someday she would meet someone who wouldn't just accept her story, but celebrate it. When she met Daniel Price, that belief seemed to come true. Daniel came into her life like sunlight after a storm. He was tall, confident, and charming in a quiet, effortless way. They met at a charity photography event where Ava's work was being displayed. Daniel had stopped to compliment her photographs, drawn in by her eye for detail. He was a construction manager, practical and grounded, the type of man who fixed things and made them work. Their first conversation stretched on for hours, and before long, they were inseparable. Daniel admired her creativity, and Ava admired his steadiness. She found safety in him, a rare calm she hadn't known before. For the first time, Ava felt like she didn't need to explain herself. Daniel made her feel beautiful and normal in a world that often treated her like both were impossible. They spent weekends traveling, taking long drives through the countryside, and dreaming about a home by the lake someday. Within a year, Daniel proposed during a dinner at the same restaurant where they had first met. The ring was simple, but to Ava, it meant everything. It was proof that she was finally seen, finally chosen, without condition. She didn't hesitate for a second before saying yes. The months leading up to the wedding were filled with excitement. Ava poured her heart into every detail, from the flowers to the music to the lace on her dress. Daniel seemed happy too, though at times, his smiles didn't quite reach his eyes. He had discovered Ava's transgender history months earlier, not from her, but from an old social media post he stumbled upon. The discovery had shaken him deeply. He never told her that he knew. Instead, he buried the discomfort under layers of affection and denial. He told himself that it didn't matter, that love was enough. But in quiet moments, the thought gnawed at him. The wedding day arrived on a warm spring afternoon. Friends gathered in a small garden outside the city, surrounded by white roses and soft music. Ava looked radiant, her joy so genuine it filled the air. Daniel held her hand tightly as they exchanged vows, his voice steady even as his heart raced. To everyone watching, they were the perfect couple, two people who had overcome their struggles to find happiness together. The photos from that day would later be shared everywhere, showing smiles so convincing that no one could have guessed the secrets hidden behind them. After the ceremony, Ava and Daniel talked endlessly about their honeymoon. She had always dreamed of the Maldives, of clear blue water and white sand, of taking photographs that captured peace. It was her idea of paradise. Daniel agreed without hesitation. He said he wanted their marriage to begin somewhere beautiful, somewhere untouched. Ava spent weeks planning every detail, from their ocean villa to the excursions they would take. It felt like the start of something new, a chapter without shadows. When they boarded the plane, Ava couldn't stop smiling. She watched the clouds pass beneath them, imagining how their life would unfold. Daniel sat beside her, his expression unreadable. He had convinced himself that the trip would help him find clarity, that maybe he could let go of the discomfort still sitting in his chest. He told himself that the love he felt for her would eventually silence the doubts. But as the plane descended over the sparkling turquoise ocean, a strange heaviness settled over him. He couldn't explain it, only that something inside him felt like it was breaking. Ava didn't notice. She was too busy capturing the moment, the beauty of the sky, the promise of the sea, the man she thought would protect her forever. To her, the trip was a symbol of everything she had fought for: authenticity, love, and a future she once thought impossible. When they reached the resort, the world seemed perfect. The air smelled of salt and flowers. The water glowed in shades of blue she had never seen before, and the sound of waves lulled her into peace. Daniel smiled for her camera, holding her waist as she took photos of them together. In those snapshots, everything looked real: two newlyweds wrapped in sunlight, untouched by pain. But even in paradise, there are places where darkness hides. In Daniel's mind, that darkness had already begun to whisper. And while Ava dreamed of a lifetime of love, his thoughts drifted towards something much colder, an ending neither of them could have imagined when they first said, "I do." The first few days of the honeymoon were exactly as Ava had imagined. The island shimmered with life, its waters 1,000 shades of blue, its skies so clear they looked painted. Each morning, sunlight spilled into their overwater villa, waking her gently. She would rush to the deck with her camera, capturing the golden reflections that danced across the waves. Daniel would stand beside her with his coffee, silent but smiling, his gaze distant. Ava believed it was simply the peace of the place taking hold of him. She didn't realize that silence had begun to grow roots inside him, spreading quietly through his thoughts. Their days were filled with activities that should have felt joyful: snorkeling through coral gardens, dining beneath the stars, exploring tiny sandbanks that appeared at low tide. Ava's laughter echoed across the water as she took photo after photo, eager to preserve every second. She posted some of them online, tagging them with captions about love and gratitude. The comments poured in, friends admiring her happiness, strangers celebrating her courage. But one night, when Daniel scrolled through those same posts, the words cut differently for him. The mentions of her transition, the way people praised her for living openly, the history she had never told him herself, it all came rushing back as he lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above. He told himself that he loved her, that he had chosen this life. Yet his thoughts turned bitter. He imagined the whispers of coworkers, the judgment of his friends if they ever found out. He began to wonder if their marriage had been a mistake, if he had been tricked into something he didn't fully understand. The resentment that had once been small and quiet started to swell, feeding on his own insecurities. Ava, exhausted from a long day in the sun, slept soundly beside him, unaware that something inside the man she loved was starting to fracture. By the fourth day, Daniel's behavior had shifted. He laughed less, spoke less, and his eyes no longer softened when he looked at her. Ava noticed but brushed it aside, assuming he was just tired. She booked them a spa appointment and surprised him with a private dinner on the beach, complete with candles flickering in the ocean breeze. He smiled for her camera, but the smile disappeared as soon as the lens lowered. That night, she reached for his hand, but he pulled away. She told herself it didn't matter. Couples had quiet moments too. Still, she couldn't shake the unease that began creeping in around the edges of her joy. The next morning, Daniel spent hours alone on the villa's deck, staring out at the endless horizon. His thoughts circled around the same dark loop. Every time he looked at her, he saw not the woman he married, but the truth he couldn't accept. He felt deceived, humiliated, and cornered by emotions he didn't have the strength to understand. The calm ocean below mocked him with its stillness. Inside his chest, the storm only grew louder. Ava tried to bring him back to her world. She suggested another adventure, something lighthearted: jet skiing, maybe a boat ride to one of the nearby islands. When he agreed, she took it as a sign that things were improving. She didn't see how tightly he clenched his fists or how his eyes stayed cold as he spoke. She spent that evening packing their essentials, humming to herself, believing that the next day would bring them closer again. Daniel, however, had already begun forming a plan. As the sun set, they walked along the beach hand in hand. The air was soft, and the water lapped gently at their feet. Ava felt safe again, her earlier worry fading. She spoke about the life they would build when they returned home, the gallery she wanted to open, the house by the lake they had once dreamed of. Daniel nodded, saying little. Inside, he was replaying every thought that had driven him toward this quiet rage. He imagined how his life would look if he left her, if people found out, if his world collapsed under the weight of the truth. Later that night, after Ava fell asleep, Daniel stood on the balcony looking out over the glowing lagoon. The moonlight painted the water silver, the surface calm and perfect. He thought about what it would mean to start over, to erase everything that made him feel weak or ashamed. He told himself he didn't hate her, but that what she represented had ruined him. In his twisted logic, ending it felt like reclaiming control. When Ava woke the next morning, Daniel was unusually affectionate. He kissed her forehead, offered her coffee, and suggested they take the private boat trip she had been talking about since they arrived. Ava's face lit up with excitement. She packed her camera, sunscreen, and a small lunch, thrilled that her husband seemed happy again. She thought the tension had finally passed. They set off just before noon, the sun high and golden over the sea. Ava laughed as the wind tossed her hair, snapping pictures of the endless blue horizon. Daniel watched her through dark sunglasses, his expression unreadable. To her, it was another perfect day in paradise. To him, it was the day everything would end. The sea ahead looked calm, but beneath its surface, it was deep and merciless, just like the secret that had begun to consume him. The morning was clear and bright, the kind of morning that felt almost unreal in its perfection. The resort staff waved as Daniel and Ava boarded the small speedboat, unaware of the weight that hung in the air between them. The sea stretched endlessly around them, shifting between shades of turquoise and deep blue. Ava sat near the edge, her camera in hand, clicking away at everything. The sunlight sparkling on the waves, the gentle curve of the horizon, the smile Daniel forced for her lens. To her, these were memories being made. To him, they were evidence of something he couldn't bear to face. As the boat sped farther from shore, the resort disappeared behind them until it was nothing but a blur. Ava felt free, laughing as the salty air whipped through her hair. She had dreamed of this trip since she was a teenager, long before she ever believed someone would love her enough to share it. She imagined showing these photos to their future children someday, telling them how their parents had started their life together surrounded by ocean and sunlight. Daniel didn't speak much. He just kept his eyes on the water, his jaw clenched so tightly that his temples pulsed. After nearly an hour, they slowed near a quiet lagoon surrounded by rocky cliffs and coral reefs. The water was shallow and calm, glowing like liquid glass beneath the sun. Ava stood, adjusting her camera strap, and began taking photos of the breathtaking scenery. Daniel watched her silently, his mind clouded with thoughts he couldn't escape. He felt the anger boiling again, the voice inside whispering that she had tricked him, that everyone would laugh at him if they knew the truth. The voice grew louder with each passing second, drowning out reason, compassion, and every trace of love that once lived inside him. Ava called out to him, motioning for him to join her in a selfie. She smiled wide, holding the camera up, unaware of the darkness behind his stare. That single photograph would become the final image of her life. Within moments, everything changed. What happened next was pieced together later through forensic evidence and the fragmented memories Daniel would later confess. He lunged forward in a sudden fit of rage, his hands shaking as he shouted words that the ocean swallowed whole. Ava stumbled backward, the camera slipping from her grasp and landing on the deck. She tried to steady herself, confusion flashing across her face. Daniel's fury erupted into violence. A struggle broke out, brief, desperate, and silent except for the splash of water and the thud of bodies colliding. Then there was only stillness. The boat drifted aimlessly, the gentle current rocking it like a cradle. Ava's camera slid across the wet floor, its lens cracked but still recording. The last frame it captured showed a reflection in the water, a distorted image of Daniel standing over her. When he finally looked down, realization hit him like a wave. The rage that had driven him moments ago vanished, leaving behind only horror and disbelief. He knelt beside her, his breath ragged, trying to convince himself that she might still be alive. But the sea was already beginning to claim her. Panic took over. He lifted her body, whispering apologies into the void, but the lifelessness in her expression was undeniable. For a long moment, Daniel sat there, his mind empty. Then, slowly, he began to think, coldly, deliberately. He had to make it look like an accident. People drowned all the time on honeymoons. No one would question it if he said she slipped, that he tried to save her. He pulled her close one last time before lowering her into the water. She sank quickly, the bright fabric of her dress fading beneath the surface until it was gone completely. Hours later, Daniel returned to the resort alone. His clothes were wet, his face pale but calm. He told the staff that his wife had fallen while taking pictures, that he had dived in after her but couldn't find her. The authorities were called, and a search began immediately. Daniel played the part of the grieving husband flawlessly, his voice trembling, his eyes red, his hands shaking just enough to look real. The staff comforted him, believing every word. For 2 days, divers combed the waters around the lagoon. The ocean was vast, but the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. On the third morning, local fishermen spotted something floating near a coral shelf. When they approached, they found Ava's body tangled in seaweed, her skin pale, her camera strap still looped around her wrist. The bruises on her arms and the gash on her head told a story the ocean couldn't erase. When police brought Daniel to identify her, he broke down instantly. He clutched her hand and sobbed, repeating the same story about the accident. But even as he wept, the detectives exchanged uneasy glances. The injuries didn't match his explanation, and the currents in that area were too weak to have pulled her far. Something about his grief felt rehearsed. And when they recovered the memory card from her camera, the last image sealed his fate, a faint reflection of Daniel standing over her. His expression twisted with something far darker than sorrow to be why the time the investigators realized what really happened, paradise had turned into a crime scene. The honeymoon that began as a dream had ended in silence, swallowed by the same ocean Ava once thought would bring her peace. The police investigation began quietly, with the resort trying to keep the situation contained. Tourists were still arriving daily, and management wanted to avoid headlines that could scare them away. But behind the calm front desk smiles, whispers spread quickly. A young bride had died during her honeymoon, and her husband's story didn't quite add up. The local authorities questioned Daniel several times in the first 2 days. He told the same version each time. Ava slipped while taking photos, hit her head on the edge of the boat, and fell into the sea. He claimed he dove in after her, but the current was too strong, and he couldn't save her. His voice was steady, and he even managed to force tears when the officers pressed him for more detail. For a moment, it seemed like his story might hold. Accidents happened often enough, and Daniel appeared genuinely broken. But when the police examined his injuries, they noticed small inconsistencies. The cut on his hand wasn't from coral, as he had claimed. It was more like a scratch from fingernails. He explained it away quickly, saying it must have happened during his rescue attempt, and the officers noted it but didn't push further. Still, they sent Ava's body for an autopsy, following standard procedure. The autopsy results changed everything. The medical examiner found bruises along Ava's wrists and arms, indicating she had been grabbed tightly before her death. The angle and depth of the wound on her head didn't match a fall. It looked more like a deliberate strike. There was also evidence of water in her lungs, suggesting she had been alive when she went under. The combination of those findings pointed to foul play. What the authorities had first treated as a tragic accident was now officially a homicide. When the Maldivian police presented the findings to Daniel, his demeanor shifted. He tried to maintain his composure, insisting that it was all wrong, that he loved his wife and would never hurt her. He begged them to release him, claiming he was being framed by circumstance. But his calm began to crumble when they mentioned Ava's camera. The device had been found near the lagoon, its memory card still intact. Investigators had already viewed the final images. One of them showed Ava smiling, her reflection framed against the water. Another, taken just seconds later, showed Daniel's faint reflection looming behind her, his posture tense and unnatural. Detectives began piecing together a timeline using hotel surveillance footage. Security cameras showed Daniel leaving the villa alone that morning with a large bag. Ava joined him minutes later, smiling and waving to a staff member who would later confirm that she seemed happy. Hours later, Daniel returned by himself. His shirt was soaked, and his hands trembled as he asked the front desk for help. When asked why he hadn't called for assistance immediately after the incident, he said he panicked. But phone records showed he had made several short calls from the boat after the time Ava supposedly fell, none of them to emergency services. The embassy in Male was notified, and soon, American officials became involved. News of Ava's death spread online, and within days, the story reached the United States. Social media lit up with questions and outrage. Ava's best friend, Lila Carter, refused to stay silent. She knew Ava's marriage hadn't been as perfect as it looked on social media. A week before the wedding, Ava had confided that Daniel had grown distant, sometimes cold, but she believed it was just pre-wedding nerves. Lila began posting publicly, demanding answers, tagging journalists and LGBTQ advocacy groups. Her persistence pushed the case into international attention, forcing local authorities to act faster and more transparently. Daniel's calm mask began to break under pressure. He sat through hours of questioning, replaying his story until the words no longer sounded convincing. Investigators from both countries pressed him about the inconsistencies, the bruises, and the photos. At first, he denied everything, saying he had no idea how she got hurt. But late one night, after nearly 12 hours of interrogation, he began to crack. His voice dropped, and he muttered that things had gotten out of hand. When the detectives asked what he meant, he said it wasn't supposed to happen. He just lost control. The partial confession led to his formal arrest. Daniel was charged with second-degree murder, and the story became a global headline within hours. News anchors recounted the timeline, showing pictures of the smiling couple on the beach and contrasting them with images of Daniel in handcuffs. Commentators debated his motive, some suggesting jealousy, others speculating that his inability to accept Ava's identity had turned into rage. In the following days, journalists arrived at the resort, filling the island with cameras and questions. The honeymoon destination that once symbolized love and serenity was now at the center of a murder scandal. Guests whispered in dining halls, staff avoided reporters, and police boats patrolled the surrounding waters for remaining evidence. Ava's body was flown home, where her friends organized a vigil. Hundreds attended, holding candles and photos of her smiling face. Lila stood before the crowd and spoke about her friend's kindness, her courage, and the love she gave so freely to a world that often gave her nothing back. As the sun set that evening, her words echoed what everyone already knew. Ava Monroe's death was not just a tragedy. It was a reminder of the quiet dangers that still existed for people like her. even in the arms of those who claimed to love them. The trial began almost a year after Ava's death, held in a packed courtroom that buzzed with reporters, cameras, and quiet outrage. The case had grown beyond a simple criminal proceeding. It had become a symbol. Around the world, people followed updates through headlines and documentaries, each trying to make sense of how a dream honeymoon had ended in such horror. Daniel Price sat at the defense table, dressed neatly in a suit, his once confident posture replaced by a hollow stillness. The man who had once been praised for his composure now looked worn and empty. The prosecution began with the autopsy report, displaying photos and diagrams that detailed Ava's injuries. The evidence was undeniable. The bruising patterns on her wrists showed she had been restrained, and the wound on her head revealed deliberate force. They played the forensic reconstruction video that outlined how she couldn't have fallen as Daniel had claimed. Each fact built a wall around him, closing off any chance of innocence. Then came the photographs from Ava's camera, her last moments frozen in time. The courtroom went silent as the final image appeared on screen. Ava smiling under the sun, the ocean behind her, and the faint outline of Daniel's reflection hovering just over her shoulder. Daniel kept his eyes down through most of it. His defense attorney argued that it was a crime of passion, that Daniel had acted out of temporary emotional instability rather than intent. They tried to paint a picture of confusion, of a man overwhelmed by betrayal. But Ava's friends, who testified about her joy and kindness, shattered that narrative. They spoke of her patience, her forgiveness, her hope. They described a woman who had endured rejection her entire life, yet still found the courage to love without fear. To them, Daniel's actions weren't about confusion. They were about control and shame. The court listened to messages Ava had sent to her best friend days before her death. In them, she mentioned Daniel's growing silence, how she felt like she was walking on eggshells, but still believed they'd be okay. The words struck everyone in the room like a whisper from the grave. The prosecutors argued that Daniel's violence had been building long before that final day, that he had chosen to bury resentment until it became lethal. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he hesitated. For the first time, he admitted that he had known about Ava's past months before the wedding. He said he felt trapped, that he couldn't back out without being judged, and that on the boat, something inside him broke. His voice cracked as he said he just wanted it to stop. The courtroom was coldly quiet. Some looked away. Others shook their heads. His words didn't sound like remorse. They sounded like justification. The judge's verdict came after weeks of testimony and debate. Daniel Price was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When the decision was announced, Daniel sat motionless. There were no tears this time, no outbursts, just silence. The gavel's echo was final, closing the chapter on a man who once promised love and delivered only destruction. Ava's family and friends gathered outside the courthouse, holding her photographs. Reporters surrounded them, asking for statements, but Lila spoke for them all. She said justice had been served, but that justice could never replace what was lost. She spoke of how Ava's story had touched people around the world, how strangers had written letters, painted murals, and started discussions about transgender safety and acceptance. Ava had dreamed of making the world see beauty differently through her art. In a cruel twist, her death had made that happen. Months later, a foundation was established in her name, the Ava Monroe Trust, aimed at supporting transgender victims of domestic violence and funding safe spaces. Her photography was displayed in galleries across several cities, curated under the title Unseen Light. Each image showed fragments of her world, city streets, faces of strangers, rays of sunlight breaking through clouds. People who never met her stood in front of her work and felt her presence, not as a victim, but as an artist who had lived courageously. Daniel's name faded into obscurity as the media moved on, but Ava's story remained. Her images were printed in books, her name spoken in schools and activist circles. The resort where she had spent her final days eventually built a small memorial overlooking the lagoon, a simple plaque with her name and a line from her journal that rescuers had found in her luggage. Beauty is not about perfection. It's about surviving the storm and still wanting to see the sunrise. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, Lila visited that spot. She would sit quietly by the water, listening to the waves that had once taken her best friend. The ocean was calm, the same calm that had once disguised danger, yet somehow, in that stillness, Ava's spirit felt alive. Her story had begun as a tragedy, but over time, it became something more, a reminder of resilience, of truth, and of the simple, fragile hope that love should never cost a life.